Alrighty, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Subscribing to My Podcast. Because I have a new guest featured every week, it makes it very difficult to maintain consistent viewership. So if there's one thing that you can do to support me or the guest featured on the show, it's by interacting with my channel in every way that you can. You can always decide to unsubscribe later if you decide that you hate me or my show. With that plugging aside, enjoy my discussion with Clark Wolf is a professor here at Iowa State teaching philosophy, and he's also in the political science department. He specializes in bioethics, philosophy, politics, and policy. But really, he just talks to a lot of students, and he's just really interested in the current world and current affairs. But Clark, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, and then tell some of the viewers some important things that they should know about you.
Sure. I'm a political theorist, and I do teach in the Department of Philosophy. The political scientists allow me by courtesy to say that I'm a member of their department too, but they don't pay my salaries.
Right. So they don't get any advertising from you.
That's right. So I mostly focus on political philosophy and political theory, with emphasis on law and economics and policy. So I have a background in sort of each of those things, and I do work in the intersection of them. I'm especially interested in the way that current institutions project implications for future generations. So, for example, climate policy. Our failure to adopt a climate policy can definitely influence the life and livelihoods of our grandchildren and their grandchildren on down the line. But there are lots and lots of different ways that present choices have time-distributed effects, and I'm interested in that.
And so I guess what is the origin of this interest when you're like going through college and you're going through grad school and you're landing where you are? Where do these interests, where do they come from, and then where have they been and where are they now?
That's a good question. And my trajectory was long. So I actually took a break in graduate school from philosophy, and I took time to study economics. And I encountered these issues of time-distributed effects of economic policy. And economists have said a lot about this. So, for example, when people talk about interest rates, or when they talk about policies that incorporate something like the value of life, right? It usually incorporates what economists call a discount rate, which means that we count later events differently from the way we count more proximate events. And economists say, saving 6 lives tomorrow matters more than saving 6 lives 100 years from now. And it's not obvious that that's true, is it? I mean, in one sense, it's obvious why economic values would be discounted in that way. If I offer you $100 right now, or I say, alternately, I'll give you $100 6 years from now, you might reasonably take the $100 now and run because you don't know what's going to happen 6 years from now. I might not be around to give it to you. And I think that makes absolute sense with respect to economic decisions that involve money, because money has a market rate of interest and its value depends. Its intertemporal value depends on that rate of interest. But it's not at all obvious that it makes the same difference for human lives. If I offer you to save, one policy that would save 6 lives today versus another policy that would save 100 lives 20 years from now, is it obvious that I should discount the future lives just because they're future? And I don't think that it is.
Well, yeah, and then there's the predictive skepticism where it's hard to know what's going to happen in the future. But there's also, I can't remember what the theory is called, but it's your like judgment and decision making. It's like the metric that you use, and there's diminishing returns based on how it applies to you. Like it has to be important. So even if you offered me more money in the future, I still might take it today.
Yes.
Even if it was $100 today and you said $150, I still might want the $100 today. And it is kind of the same with people. And I also know that once you get with like policy that it decreases the importance too, to where it's like how important it is to you starts to change too. So like 1,000 people might not be exactly double as worse as 500 people, even though the numbers are exactly double. And so there's like this weird valuing thing. But I guess when you're balancing these things, I guess what are you doing in research? Like, what are you looking at? What things are important for people to hear about when you're talking about these future predictions?
Well, I think you're absolutely right to think about the $100 example. from an individual perspective. And you will frame that decision in terms of what you can do with $100 now versus what you can do with it 20 years from now or 6 years from whatever I said, right? But I would like to say that the policy perspective is a little bit different. So when we're thinking about individual decision-making, you can frame those decisions in a way that corresponds to your preferences and your ideas about what your opportunities are. But when we're framing public policy, they need to be framed from a different perspective. And my colleague in political science, Alex Tuckness, has focused a lot on what he calls the legislative point of view, the point of view where we're trying to take into account everybody's interests and not formulate policy in a way that peculiarly responds to some people and not others. So again, with respect to individual decisions, I think you're making just the right move. But when we think about policies that are going to affect everyone or going to affect a large group of people who have different preferences and different ideas, I think we need to make those from a different perspective than our private wants.
Well, yeah, and it's especially difficult too because if you're not a part of the group of people that are going to be affected, it's very easy for you to not see it as a problem.
Yes, that's right.
And so you have to convince somebody that it's this weird kind of fairness principle of you couldn't choose to have been born as a person who is able to appreciate these benefits or these things, and now you have to convince somebody to step out of their own mind and go into the mind of someone who's affected. And it's this really weird. How do you convince people not only to look and try to predict the future, but also predict the future of parties that don't even affect them?
No, I think you've put your finger on really the crux of the problem. And when you think about why people resist climate policy, right? One of the reasons that people resist is that putting in place an appropriate climate policy will involve us making sacrifices for people who are kind of an abstraction for us. My great-grandchildren don't exist yet. My grandchildren don't exist either. Right? And maybe they never will exist. But I'm quite confident that there will be people on Earth, 100 years from now, and that their lives matter. But which people will they be? Will any of them be my descendants? Should I cease to care about them if they're not? Well, from a public policy perspective, again, I think we need to think of this from a general, as much as we can, from a general point of view that weighs people's interests equally.
How would you go about roping people into this? If somebody were, let's do climate, for example. Mm-hmm. Somebody's looking at the ways the numbers work and I don't want to sacrifice this much for the future. How do you rope them in? What can you even say to get them involved in doing this?
I think it's hard, and I don't have a neat recipe for doing what you suggest here, but I wish I did. One of the things that I think it is worth doing is to look at the way people make decisions. And often I think one of the things that philosophers have been able to do well is to look at the way that people make decisions and identify ways in which those decisions are problematic or even irrational. It seems to me that if we are weighing the significance of people differently depending on when they exist, that's a questionable thing to do. And it at least requires a justification. If we don't have a reason that justifies treating people differently, we ought to treat them the same. That's a principle that has broad implication. It's the reason that underlies anti-discrimination policies. It's the reason that underlies all sorts of policies that prevent us from treating ourselves as a special case. And I think it's a reason that many people simply accept that we shouldn't treat people differently unless we have a good reason, a justifying reason to treat people differently. And then you can ask whether the fact that someone doesn't live yet is a good reason for treating their interests differently, for discounting their interests, for example. And this comes into play in a whole range of different circumstances. So you mentioned one of my roles here at the university is in bioethics. And one of the places where this comes into play involves what sorts of medical interventions we should fund, right? If we have alternate medical interventions that treat people in utero for diseases that or disadvantages that they might otherwise develop when they are adults. And we're comparing those with treatments for people that, involve genetic selection so that, so that people aren't conceived who would have, genetically transmitted disadvantages. Those have very different effects. They might result in the same number of people being relieved of deleterious symptoms, but they're very different policies. One of them involves helping people who would have existed anyway, and the other involves, in one sense, to put it in a potentially pejorative way, preventing people from existing who might have suffered disadvantages. Now, it turns out that people who know that they carry deleterious genes now have the ability to have their genes sequenced so that they can prevent passing deleterious traits off to their children. That is the second kind of policy intervention. It does involve preventing the conception of people who would otherwise have and be able to pass on deleterious traits to their children. It turns out in the real world, people who realize, who know that they carry deleterious genetic traits, overwhelmingly, when they're able to, they select to avoid passing those traits on to their children. And I find that an interesting individual policy. It's one thing, however, to have people individually accepting or adopting that policy, and it's quite a different thing for that kind of policy intervention to be imposed as a command and control thing from external sources. And we might be willing to accept one of those and not the other.
Well, and it's really particular. I think history does a really good job of defending working for future people. I think if you look at you're benefiting from all of the work that people in the past have put towards you existing. So people in the past had these future insights and they're like, I'm going to write these rules so that you get to benefit from these things. Even the Constitution was theoretically founded so that it can last forever and help all Americans, you know what I mean?
One hopes.
One hopes, right. And whether it turns out that way is
I think our Constitution is precious in part because it's fragile, right? I don't think that we can be confident that our Constitution will last forever. I think it's increasingly evident that democracy and constitutional republics are dependent on all sorts of factors that we may not have appreciated properly.
Well, I guess especially because there's the idea of setting the future people up for success and then whether or not those future people use it for success and whether things have changed. But I guess what I'm saying is they were making a prediction that the future people were going to benefit from this, which is why they made it that way. And I think that it's weird to be put in the same position as in you get to make policy that are going to help people in the future and to deny that responsibility, just to be like, it doesn't really matter as much. It doesn't make any sense because you're benefiting from people who had future sight and you're unwilling to do the same. Let me just say something in response to that, because certainly the framers of our Constitution had future generations in mind. They expressly put in the Constitution the idea that we would protect the benefits of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. It's there early in the Constitution, and they clearly had in mind that this was an intergenerationally valuable document. Jefferson especially had deep thoughts, wrote consistently about the implications of our present policies and our present institutions on subsequent generations. And he was worried, for example, about things like national debt. He was worried that a profligate present would build up a national debt that would be unduly costly, unfairly, unjustly impose costs on later people. Well, yeah, and it's kind of one of those things where I feel like it's within your best interest to worry about the people in the future. Now, that is a broad statement because once it gets caveated with, well, you also have to pay this amount of money, that's when things get a little uncomfortable. So I guess when you're making policy, how are you kind of justifying, I'm going to work towards this future end while also understanding the cost. I'm very interested in this when it comes to climate and environment. So like when it comes to cost of keeping the environment clean, these future things versus the prospect, how do you kind of weigh these decisions?
I wish I had an ideal way to make these decisions. A lot of my work involves looking at economic and political policy tools that people use to select one policy over another, and looking at the way existing policy tools reflect, or as more often fail to reflect, the interests of future people who are deeply affected by those policies. Think of democracy, for example, right? Democracy, and don't get me wrong, I am an adamant and passionate defender of democratic institutions, but we get to vote. Right? We get to vote right now, and my grandchildren don't get to vote on policies that we're adopting right now that influence their lives. Now, there's no easy way to get that vote, to know what my grandchildren would say, but the fact that their interests simply are not reflected in current democratic decisions seems, sometimes to me when I think of it, it seems deeply unfair, because we're making decisions that determine the circumstances of life of people who don't have any recourse. They don't have any way to reprimand us for our profligate decisions or our failing decisions.
Yeah, well, and wow, that was profound. That makes a lot of sense, because it's too late for them. By the time, if they're struggling with climate-related things, it's too late for them to make a decision for these things, which is why I refer to it as within your own self-interest to be voting for the things in the future, because you would have hoped that you'd get that opportunity in the past. You would hope that people in the past were voting for you, because my great-great-grandparents were having this exact same conversation about whatever was happening hundreds of years ago, right?
Yes.
So,
well, we wonder. I mean, you might wonder, looking back at previous generations, whether they did effectively take our interests into account. So I'm going to ask you to think back for a long way. Think about Pleistocene hunters in North America. One theory is that the reason there are no woolly mammoths and hairy rhinoceroses and giant sloths running around Iowa, one theory about this, and it's not universally accepted, I'm not even sure, I don't think it's the most popular theory among anthropologists, but one theory is that they were hunted to extinction. Now, I think we might benefit. I would like for there to be hairy rhinoceroses running around Iowa. It would be really cool, right? And did previous generations violate our rights if the extinction of the hairy rhinoceros has to do with the fact that Pleistocene hunters drove them to extinction? That's sort of a fanciful example, but we can think of much easier examples as well. So previous generations have put us in the situation we're in now with respect to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And that's a process that started 100 years ago. It didn't start, it started with the Industrial Revolution and the burning of fossil fuels, heavy-duty burning of fossil fuels. And it's, in that respect, a very new problem, but it's a problem that we didn't just create, we inherited it. And we're continuing to participate in it. But it's a deep problem. It certainly, I would want to say, that's a problem we inherited from the past. So when we look at the basket that we inherit from previous generations, it includes spectacular things like the Constitution, like the rule of law, like computers. I couldn't live without the technology that I depend on every day. Warm houses, easy access to food and shelter and medical care, all sorts of benefits of technology and research and science that we enjoy. But it also includes a whole range of costs and disadvantages that we might otherwise have enjoyed. It's difficult to balance those against each other. I guess when I look at the balance, it seems to me that for us, for our generation, it has been overwhelmingly positive. But when I look at the effects of our choices on subsequent generations, it's not at all obvious to me that the effects of our choices and our policies will have a similar beneficial effect on distant future generations who depend on us. They depend on us to do the right thing.
Well, yeah, well, and I guess how serious do you attribute the climate problem to be, maybe for the future generations?
That's a difficult question, right? I mean, its seriousness depends on the number of people who are affected by it, and that number is huge. With respect to climate, much depends on what we do in the next 10 years, really, 10 to 20 years. It's altogether possible that we could develop technology for removing CO2 from the atmosphere. It's possible. There are reasons why that's a difficult technological advance to effect. But there are other ways that we could influence future generations. We could adopt sustainable policies that would reduce the impact of our lives on the world that they will inherit from us. I guess to get back to the question, right? You asked how serious is this problem? I think it's very serious. I think the risks that we're imposing on future generations are very serious risks, and it's open to discussion about whether or not the benefits that we're sending down the pike to them in the distant future, whether those benefits adequately compensate them for the disadvantages that they will incur as a result of changing equilibria in ecological systems that will no doubt, we're going to send them a world that doesn't have the Great Barrier Reef in it. It doesn't have an enormous ecosystems that have benefited us in ways that we do not understand. Right? Our ability to interact with the world depends on rainforests and kelp forests. It depends on permafrost in the far north. It depends on a whole range of things that we don't realize that we're interacting with every day. Right? The flow of ocean currents changes the climate in the Lofoten Islands of Norway and changes the climate of Britain, which could change dramatically if those currents change as a result of, well, melting ice and other alterations in ocean temperatures and climate.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting. I think that the biggest excuse that I hear people who are against putting money towards climate change, the biggest excuse that I feel like they give is they say that this has been a problem for the last 100 years. You know what I mean? And they're not seeing the negatives of it, and that they're using that as a predictor that it's not going to be a problem in the future. Is there a way that you can kind of grasp against this, or how do you?
Yeah. Well, people often talk about tipping points, and one way to think about a tipping point is to think about, a piece of paper that you hold with an arc over your head, and if you gradually bend your fingers, there comes a point when the paper flips to another equilibrium, right? And ecological systems may be similar in that respect. We may not notice the difference if we're living on the peak of that, of that equilibrium. We may not notice the difference much until it flips to another equilibrium and things change. So it's altogether possible. And in fact, in many ecological systems, it's not just possible, it's actual, that small-scale changes that seem imperceptible to us can ultimately lead to large-scale changes that imply enormous alterations in the world that we pass on, or in the ecosystems that we pass on. One of my favorite examples in this regard is the cod fishery on the east coast of North America, which provided Europe with cod for hundreds of years. It provided North America with cod for hundreds of years. To our shame, right? Canada and the United States, to our shame, we taxed that resource almost into extinction. And we did tax it into a different equilibrium. It's now, as I understand, and I haven't looked at most recent ecological studies of cod shoals on North America, but my understanding is that ecosystem is now in an absolutely new equilibrium that doesn't involve cod in the way that it used to. So those cod, it's not as if we stop fishing for them with trawlers and drift nets, not drift. If we stop fishing for them, they'll come back. They won't come back. The ecosystem is in a new equilibrium that doesn't involve cod in the same way that it used to. It's changed utterly.
Yeah, and I think it's difficult to see the risk of these things when it's coming from the mouth of somebody that you have identified as just your opposition. And I feel like in the current climate and the way people are talking about this thing, even you just defending that, and you've been pretty, I guess, I don't know what the word is, but you've been very chill when it comes to saying like, it's possible. It is completely, you've been hedging very comfortably around these things. Yet I feel like if I were to post a clip of you saying that, you would get pinged as a crazy liberal. And so I guess I just wonder, like, tell me just about today's current climate with identity, with the way people are pinging other people, because I feel like it's really important that you kind of qualify the things that you're saying, but against this idea that you're just a crazy liberal, and I don't know why you're talking. You know what I mean? So how is today's current climate with that going?
Let me respond in two modes. First of all, I want to say that concern about future generations is not a liberal concern. It's not a conservative concern. Concern about the environment is not either. It's not a liberal or a conservative concern. The environmental laws in the United States, many of the most efficacious laws, date from the Nixon administration. They date from a Republican administration. And for a long time, the environment was, in the United States, a deeply conservative cause. And there's no particular reason why it should be either conservative or liberal. So that's one thing I'd want to say. Concern about our children and our grandchildren is not uniquely liberal or uniquely conservative. It's something that, well, those of us who have children, and I have two kids, have an individual private reason for caring that the future provides them with opportunities that will give them the ability to live good lives. But I think all of us have an obligation to take other people into account when our actions and our policies influence them. So that's a partial response to that thought. But the other side of your question has to do with political divisions. And I do think that in the United States, one of the things people point out is that we're more divided now politically than we ever have been before. So we see discussions that represent one side as the woke liberals and the other side as the MAGA Republicans, and each side regards the other's side to be intractable enemies. Right? You don't argue with someone whom you regard to be so beyond the reach of reason that they can't be moved by arguments or reasons or data. I actually think most people are not like that. And I think we make a mistake when we make political arguments toward the extreme sides. I think it has a distorting effect on us and on the way we think about political issues. If I'm always arguing against woke liberals, if I'm always arguing against, the radical right, then I think I leave out the vast majority of us who are sensitive to data, responsive to reasons, and concerned about many of the same issues. I really think that it's possible to have political discussions that are not polarized in the way that political discussions tend to be, both on the web and on the news, in the newspapers. I think it's unfortunate. We seem to be living in a time when political polarization is increasing in a dramatic way, and I think many people attribute that to the influence of social media and the web, and I think there certainly is a case for that claim. I think there's a special kind of inflexible reasoning that we adopt when we become ideologically bound. So to be an ideologue, right, to be in the grip of an ideology is to look at the world through a certain lens. So I'm thinking capitalism and socialism can both be embraced in a way that's ideological. And if one is in the grip of an ideology that says that free market capitalist institutions are the ideal, then you will look at incursions into the market, whether that be environmental protection or production of public goods, education, roads, medical care. You'll look at efforts to provide policies that provide those goods to people as inappropriate incursions into what otherwise would be a free market. That is not necessarily wrong, but simply to respond to those kinds of policies as incursions into the market makes one impervious to the reasons or the data that might otherwise inform our understanding of those policies. A more flexible way to think about issues like this would be to look at public education, look at whether or not institutions and countries that provide public education for everyone, for including poor families and rural families who don't have access to private schools. We need to look at whether educational outcomes improve. In thinking about public health care, so many people responded to Obamacare, so-called, right, simply as an incursion into the market. But it's worth looking at the cost of health care, say, in Britain or Canada or Australia. Is it more expensive or less expensive to have publicly provided health care? The United States has the most expensive health care in the world. And we also have worse healthcare outcomes than Canada, the UK, Australia, other countries that have publicly provided systems. So I would like to say, if one responds to proposals to provide public health care merely by seeing them as incursions into free market economics, one is in the grip of an ideology that prevents one from thinking flexibly and responding to data, responding to reasons. And I kind of regret that my first example came from the right, because I think it's equally implausible. It's equally problematic to be in the grip of an ideological, left-leaning model of the world that makes one inflexible or unable to see the benefits of another kind of organization. So, for example, I think many people on the left are reluctant to see market mechanisms for providing public goods or for providing for climate policy. Right? We price carbon. Right? But one of the things the Kyoto Protocol did was to put a price on carbon and try to create carbon markets. Many people responded to that as inappropriate. Right? One philosopher, Robert Gooden, called it like selling environmental indulgences. Right? You're selling people the right to sin, where in fact there's no good way simply to eliminate carbon from our budget, and having carbon markets leads people to put a price on what otherwise is the free right to emit carbon. Another recent context, right? There are proposals in India. Well, actually, not a proposal. In India, water has a price, right? And I've seen many people argue it's absolutely inappropriate to put a price on a public necessity like water. It should be free. It should be freely available to everyone. It sounds very good, but when water is free, it gets used in all sorts of ways that are problematic. So the cheap water in Arizona means that cheap water it's not used for public necessities. It's used to create golf courses in the desert. It's used to grow rice and almonds in areas that should not properly, right? They can't sustainably support almond and tree nut farming. But because water is so freely available for farmers in southern Arizona, it's used profligately. Putting a price on water is a good policy. It's not a right or a left policy. It's good policy. And it seems to me that people on the left should recognize that it's a necessity for sustainable agricultural policy to put a price on things that would otherwise be used in unsustainable and profligate ways.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I think one of the things at the beginning is I want to talk a little bit about the origin of this and I think where it comes from, I'm definitely on the side that it's a lot to do with social media. It's a lot to do with the internet. I feel like never before were humans able to hear the opinions of not only people who have very little in common with them. Even like an Iowan having a say in what's going on in California is a little like iffy, but let alone like what I have to say about things going on in South Korea. You know what I mean? We're just in very different situations, but I feel like 70 years ago, you might have interacted with 1,000 people a year, let alone like on TikTok, I'm no joke interacting with thousands of people a day. You know, just with like a quick, like 1 second, I'm interacting with that many people's opinions, ideas. And I just feel like it's become a little difficult to actually decipher information. And so now you're just using a heuristic to be like, well, I'm just going to, I know that this person's like this, so I'm just going to discount this. I guess like where do you attribute, like how much of this origin do you attribute to maybe the internet, some other things? Where do you find that these ideas are coming from, and how do you kind of chip away at this? How would you even go about solving this?
I don't know how to solve this problem. I do think you're right. I think one of the things that the internet has made possible is it's made it possible for us to live in an echo chamber where we never seriously engage the views of someone who disagrees with our understanding of policy. And when we do interact with people who disagree, we interact with them as if they're wild, crazy radicals, right? We interact with them in an ideological mode rather than interacting as people who share a common problem to solve problems together. If I dismiss you as a woke liberal, or if I dismiss you as a Nazi, or whatever words we use to dismiss people, then it becomes easy for me to ignore you. And I do think that the internet allows people to see the political opposition as they're just authoritarian Nazis, right? And surely we don't need to listen to people like that. But my conservative relatives, and I have people I love, members of my family who are on multiple sides of the political spectrum. I don't want to say both sides because I think it diminishes the plurality of political views to say that there are just two sides. But I think if we recognize that there are reasonable people who are trying to solve problems on all sides, multiple sides of the political spectrum, then it will allow us to avoid simply framing our political issues in an ideological mode. They're the enemy. Therefore, we don't need to take into account what their views are. Well, that's a mistake, right? I mean, we need to forge public policies that take into account people who have a wide variety of different perspectives. And the fact that someone is on the left, the fact that someone is on the right should not be a reason simply to dismiss the goals that they're trying to pursue or the policies they're trying to promote.
Well, and it's particularly difficult because I can hear people who are listening to this and they're like, yeah, those other guys really just don't know how to do it. And I'm like,
yeah.
I'm like, it's you. I'm talking about you. You know what I mean? Towards like this really weird, like you'll hear they'll be like, oh, I'm not a part of that camp, but I agree with every single thing that Trump has ever said. And it's this really weird thing where it's like, at that moment, it becomes really useful to identify somebody on the right or left because they uniquely agree with every single thing. Now, I'm skeptical that anybody who agrees with every single policy in any ideology, I don't know if any ideology is 100% right on everything. And I feel like if you're in those camps, you're automatically on the chopping block in this conversation. But beyond that, I guess like, are there ways that you can identify somebody who's struggling with this or who is in this camp, somebody who's, not to say that you aren't in this camp, but like, how do you snap somebody out of it? Because everyone's hopefully heard something like this before, but it hasn't worked.
let me start by giving you an example. So when I was a graduate student at the University of Arizona, I was studying philosophy and economics, and I was Marx curious. Right? I mean, Marx has had this enormous influence on the thinking of sociologists and economists and policy choice. It's had an enormous influence on the world. And I put out a little call for a Marx reading group. And we were very small. We were 5 people. One of the people who joined the Marx reading group was absolutely amazing. She could quote chapter and verse. She had the kind of encyclopedic understanding of Marx that I will never have this encyclopedic understanding, the ability simply to respond by citing the section in Marx where Marx discusses something, right? She had a Maoist interpretation of Marx because of her training. She had learned Marx. She had carefully studied Marx in a Maoist vein, and her interpretation of Marx was, I found, peculiar. But I learned a tremendous amount from her. She learned nothing from me. Right? I would raise objections and I would raise reasons, and immediately she would have the answer. Right? Every piece of data that I introduced, every reason that I introduced was seen in light of the ideological perspective that she had adopted. And in one respect, I have great respect for this person. Right? I remember her fondly. In another respect, it really seems to me she is, in my mind, the epitome of an ideologically bound person. She was responding to everything, not by incorporating it and taking into account new data and changing her views in light of changing circumstances. She had the truth, right? She was viewing Marx the way some people view the Bible. And I think that's always a mistake. I think it's always a mistake to adopt a view in ways that make one impervious to new data or new reasons or new considerations that one might not have thought of. So that's part of my experience, and it was a good experience for me. It was a good experience to interact with this person, but I don't aspire to be like that, and I think it's a mistake when we find ourselves inflexibly bound that way. Now, I think I've left your question behind, so I'm going to give you an opportunity to re-articulate it.
No, that was a good. It's a good thing, I guess. Something to talk about in regards to that. I can hear Jordan Peterson in my mind speaking to me when he says that, like, there are certain ideologies that are incredibly dangerous. So it might not be that you are, following a specific thing to a T. That might not be super common, but what I feel like is common is to attribute one side as like, hey, I'm not saying I have all the answers, but you have all the wrong answers. And so I feel like when you're talking about like Marx, it would be like to even allow that kind of conversation, I can hear certain people being like, no, we don't do that here. You know what I mean? Like, we don't really like it when people talk like that. And so it's kind of the opposite thing to where it's like, it's not necessarily that they're ascribing 100% a certain ideology, it's that they hate every aspect of a certain ideology. I don't know if that is the same problem to you or if that's like has a different attitude or how you feel about that.
I think what you're describing is very, very similar to what I'm seeing as ideological straitjacketing.
Right.
Right? I mean, if you're in an ideological straitjacket, you think about things in terms of friend and enemy, or, the people you listen to and the people you ignore. I think Jordan Peterson is an interesting example. When I listen to Jordan Peterson, I find that I agree with some things that he says, and I disagree with a whole range of things that he says. And it seems to me that that's going to be true of anyone who's interesting, right? Anyone who's interesting. I mean, I do think Jordan Peterson, he's full confession, he's not one of my favorite interlocutors, but I think he's smart and interesting and often, usually worth listening to. Even if I disagree with him, I understand my own view better by interacting with the reasons that he offers. One of the good things about Jordan Peterson is that he offers reasons. He has reasons and background and a perspective that gives him something to say about a whole range of different issues.
Do you think that that's an important aspect? I think my question earlier was trying to find the ways to convince people who think that they are not a part of this problem, but are. To me, a good way of assessing whether or not you are part of this problem or not is whether or not you are able to say things like that about people that you disagree with. Because a lot of people will be like, I watch a wide range of sources. What they mean is they don't instantly skip a TikTok that they disagree with. And that's the extent of them being exposed. Or they listen to like far left stuff and then like slightly less left stuff. You know what I mean? So I just wonder, like, to me, that's an aspect. I could tell that to a person if you have a wide range of beliefs that leads me to believe that you're not 100% in this group. Now, I guess what other ways of breaking people out of that do you think there are?
So there are two questions here, really, right? One is, how can you tell if you're living in an ideological straitjacket? And I think that's hard. I think we all have blind spots. And if one is looking at the world from the perspective of an ideological straitjacket, I think it's hard to get out. And I wish I had better advice. I have better advice for most of us, though, because I think most of us aren't necessarily in an ideological straitjacket. So I think it makes sense to ask whether when you represent the views of those with whom you disagree, are you representing the most radical version of that view? Or are you trying to present and understand what a reasonable person might hold who disagrees with your fundamental view? You mentioned earlier people who say, I agree with Trump about everything. And I guess I do. I would associate that attitude with the Maoist Marxist whom I encountered as a graduate student. I think if you agree with everything that Jordan Peterson or Marx or Trump or, I don't know, G.A. Cohen mentioned a socialist philosopher.
Right.
If you agree with everything that any of those people say, you've probably missed something. You've probably bound yourself in ways that I think we shouldn't bind ourselves intellectually. I do think that it's possible to find oneself in what you might think of as an intellectual black hole, where we're really impervious to new data. And I think we should all be interested to avoid that.
Yeah, I think another thing that I've found really awesome doing this show, doing this podcast, because I've interviewed a ton of different people with a ton of different ideologies, is that having an earnest conversation with normal people is really, really important. Even if it's an argument, even if it's a debate, it's really important to actually do the speaking, because I feel like even just listening to two people debate, political punditry is like a totally different ball game for like actual ideology than I feel like normal person living in the world. I feel like there's so many motivations that you can't see. There's so many interactions that you can't see, and they're well studied, they're well read. You might hear a statistic, you've never looked into it, you've never seen the study that it comes from, but you might cite it still, even though you've never done any research. And so you might think that these problems are really serious, but when you have a conversation with just a normal person, you realize that you both know as little as you feel like you know, but beyond that, you can find that people are actually pretty normal, even people who disagree with you.
I think it's possible for very normal people to find themselves in the grip of ideological conversations. Let me mention a context where I think this is a serious issue. Think about the issue of libraries, public libraries and school libraries. People on one side say, we shouldn't censor materials that come into libraries, and that's a powerful argument. People on the other side say, highly sexualized material on pedophilia and sex have no place in junior high school libraries. Now, you could believe both of those things, right? You could both believe that the story of O, I mean, I don't know if you know that book, but it's sort of it's my paradigm example of, a piece of literature that I really don't want available to, junior high school students. I don't even think it, I think there's a strong case for, I think there's a strong case for the idea that high school students are old enough to read just about everything. But I'm not going to put that in a high school library either.
Oh, wow. Okay, right.
The Marquis de Sade, right? I mean, those novels, those works, I don't think they belong there. It's not that I think, they should be censored. I think if you want to look them up, they should be available to you. But I don't necessarily think we should make those things readily available in school libraries. Is that censorship? Now, on the other side, I mean, I think people interested to control what's in school libraries have gone way overboard. So I want to say people on both sides of this rhetorical argument have gone way overboard. To argue nothing should be censored, nothing should be excluded from school libraries. Two, we should exclude Toni Morrison, for crying out loud, one of the jewels of American literature, right? One of the greatest authors I have encountered anywhere, right? But her books have been censored, and I do want to say they've been inappropriately excluded from school libraries. I think they should be widely available. I think that's absolutely appropriate literature for high school students to encounter. Does it include some account of sexual content or sexual interaction? Well, yes. But it's not the story of O, and anyone who tries to represent it in that way, right, has gone overboard. There are ways that both poles in that issue can go overboard and fail to represent the reasonable position that I think most people who go to school board meetings accept. I don't think we're in the grip, really, of those radical perspectives. And I think there's room for a reasonable discussion on those issues, and we're not having it. What is it that prevents people from having it? I want to say people find themselves against their will, driven into an ideologically straitjacketed position that forces them to argue as if everyone who disagrees with me must be unreasonable.
Well, and I think that the reasonable nature, I do think that you have to peel back to find it. I feel like anybody who's politically engaged, when you're having a conversation, I feel like the first and foremost thing you're probably going to get is some extremism. And I think I don't think that that's how they actually feel. I think that's how they feel as if they're supposed to feel. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like once you get past the first couple interactions with a normal person, then you start having a normal conversation. And that's why I encourage having real conversations, because I do feel like the conversations I've had with people, you'll hear the wildest, most extreme things. And you're like, whoa. And then you'll talk and then you'll challenge them on that. And they haven't heard that particular kind of challenge. And then they're very normal, because a lot of people hear these things and they just kind of regurgitate it, or they just kind of say it. I don't know if they actually feel it. And so I think that when it comes to discussion or debate, you do have to peel back a little bit, and you have to have some kind of perseverance. You have to have a little bit tougher skin to get past that first, and then to have those normal conversations. So I don't know if I'm convinced that people are forced into these things. I do think that most conversations are going to start out as people earnestly defending these extreme positions, and then they will slowly peel back and understand that they don't actually feel that strongly about it, or they're not actually that extreme about it. That might not be how it is in your case, but that's just how it's been in my very anecdotal perspective.
I hope you're right. And that is the experience I have in my classes. So I teach controversial issues in my classes. And I do find that approaching those issues from a philosophical perspective in a classroom makes it possible for people to think about them in ways that they might not otherwise have been open to address. Yeah,
and I do think that has a lot to do with learning, opening yourself up to disagreeing things. And I also think that has to do with the way you speak and the way you come at it. If you come at it very unbiased, very pleasant, very, not extreme, I think that helps people to, engage with it. You're not throwing hands right away. You're
right.
Letting them chat. I think
part of that is teaching at a public university. My students come from a wide variety of different backgrounds. And it would be absolutely inappropriate for me to impose my views on students who disagree. What I hope I do is provide students with a background to think and improve their own understanding of their own ideas. Let me say one other thing about philosophy, because in philosophy classes, we teach lots of stuff that we don't believe. I teach Plato. I am not a Platonist, right? I teach Kant. I like Kant. I love Kant. But I'm not a Kantian in all sorts of interesting respects. In my philosophy of law class, I teach the Constitution. I teach law. I teach Supreme Court decisions that I agree with. I teach Supreme Court decisions that I disagree with. I teach critical race theory in my class. I am not a critical race theorist, but I think it's crucial that students who take a course in the philosophy of law have an understanding of a wide variety of different backgrounds and different perspectives. So is it appropriate that I teach things that I don't believe, things that I think are false? Well, one of the things that I'm teaching is, I hope, I'm teaching people to look at the world from different perspectives. If you study Plato, you're able to look at the world through a Platonic worldview, which is fascinating. It's one of the most brilliant, artistic, sparkling intellects in the history of the world. Right? And it's not that I think he's right, but absolutely encountering that way of thinking about things increases your understanding of your own view. I mentioned Kant. I disagree with Immanuel Kant on a whole range of issues, but I think the things he got wrong are more interesting than almost any of the things I get right. But he's just this fascinating thinker who's, encountering that way of thinking about the world changes the way you approach everything.
Do you think that your viewpoint on how you teach is shared amongst a lot of professors in collegiate settings? Because I feel like a lot of people are kind of scared that when they go to college, they're going to get spoon-fed. Liberal propaganda is probably how they'd put it. Do you think that the way that you view teaching is common amongst professors, or do you think that that fear is valid?
I know that there's a deep fear that, colleges are occupied by liberal professors who are importing and imposing their views on innocent students who come through. I guess I look at, I regularly review the syllabi and the teaching of my colleagues, and I do not have experience that justifies that worldview, right? My experience looking over the syllabi and the courses of colleagues, I think most of them do things that are relevantly similar to what I hope I do, and what I think we all ought to do. I don't want to create Clark Wolf clones in my students, and I'm always grateful when my students argue in their papers for positions that they know I reject. Right? I don't necessarily hide my views from my students when it comes to controversial issues. I don't necessarily hide my views. Sometimes I assign my own papers, and it's hard to say, well, Wolf says this, but
right.
And I actually think that that's important, right? I think teaching one or two of my own papers helps students to understand that this is, philosophy is something you do. It's not just something you learn and read and then leave behind. It's something you do. Ideally, I hope that their encounter in my class changes the way students think about everything that they interact with in their lives. That's a lofty goal.
Right.
I really have that goal, and I don't think that one semester interaction with me can accomplish it. But I hope it takes a step toward that direction. But I'm always pleased when students, and I often find that it's the case. I often find students arguing with me in class, defending a view they know I reject, and I regularly, especially in my philosophy of law class, I regularly have students who write papers defending views that they know are at odds with the view that I would defend, and I'm always pleased.
Yeah, and I think that as far as the fear goes, I think that might be more commonplace, or they describe it as commonplace in more Ivy colleges or colleges on maybe the East Coast particularly. I don't know how true that is, but I had one of my friends come up saying that he was going into psychology and he was worried about the amount of, and I told him I've just never, working for the university has been a different experience. Even then it's not that bad, but it's definitely a different experience. But your education is unimpeded, I feel, by political stuff, at least because he was going into a similar degree as me. So
Interesting.
It was a little bit more applicable. But
I do think that there are different obligations that we have teaching at a public university. I think it's a different context. Teaching at a private university, people are freer. I find that the restrictions that properly apply to a public university professor they're restrictions that I think are absolutely appropriate. They're not restrictions that feel to me like chains. They feel like appropriate restrictions if you're going to be a teacher and not a propagandist. I did not in my own undergraduate or graduate career, I didn't encounter propagandists in general. I definitely encountered people with positions, right? So I did graduate work in economics, and I definitely had professors who were devoted to a libertarian free market perspective. And they didn't hide that fact from me when they were teaching their classes. But they didn't swat me down when I argued for, a different kind of view. They responded to reasons, and they responded with the reasons that they thought were right. And in many cases, they persuaded me that they were right. But it was persuasion, not command.
Indoctrination, I guess. So we've been pushing. I really do want to talk about this abortion case that you brought that I think is really interesting. I don't know if it would be worthwhile to caveat this with your personal opinions, but I guess just let me know tell me about this case and what you find interesting about it and what it means for the general abortion conversation.
Well, the case you proposed that we discuss in this section is a Supreme Court of Alabama case, and it's called LePage versus the Center for Reproductive Medicine. And it involves cryogenically frozen embryos that were stored in a special room in the Center for Reproductive Medicine. And it turns out that a patient, and I don't know the circumstances of this patient, wandered into the wrong room, opened the wrong, I don't know, the wrong cupboard or whatever it was. I mean, usually these are kept in cryogenically secure locations. It's not easy to get into them. Picked up vials containing embryos, noticed that they burned his hands, dropped them on the floor, and they were destroyed. So it's a case involving the destruction of embryos. The patient who did this was not prosecuted. I don't know the circumstances of this patient's situation. However, it does seem that the institution that stored these embryos is at fault for improperly protecting them, right? And if you have embryos, they are the property of the people who donated the materials, the ova and the sperm, to create fertile embryos. So in every state, including Iowa, embryos that are stored in this way are the property of the donors, and they should be stored properly. They should be protected properly so that someone can't just go in. In Alabama, it was a little stronger than that. So in Alabama, it came before the court that the destruction of embryos took place in a context where the Alabama Constitution includes an article that was called the Fetal Personhood Amendment, is sometimes called the Fetal Personhood Amendment to the Alabama Constitution, which states that unborn children, it doesn't call it an unborn fetus, unborn children are children. So when this came to the Alabama Supreme Court, the question was whether the destruction of these embryos constituted the wrongful death of a minor, right? And the Alabama Supreme Court treated the destruction of these embryos as the murder or the manslaughter of a child. Who's guilty? Well, in this case, the Center for Reproductive Medicine was on the stand, right, under prosecution for permitting the unlawful death of a minor child, as the Alabama Supreme Court interpreted this statute. Before this case came down, and it came down in, I believe, October of 1994. So, no, sorry, was it February of 1994? It was quite recent. Many states had on the docket proposed legislation and even proposed constitutional amendments, state constitutional amendments, trying to do what Alabama had already done, fetal personhood amendments. Most of those efforts were stymied. They immediately ceased after the Alabama Supreme Court case came through. After the Alabama Supreme Court case, most institutions that provide in vitro fertilization services simply shut down in Alabama. The Alabama legislature actually added a piece of legislation that was supposed to guarantee that in vitro fertilization services would continue to be available in the state of Alabama. But this legislation is ambiguously valid in the state of Alabama. You cannot overturn a constitutional amendment, and this is an amendment that's in the Alabama state constitution. You can't overturn a constitutional amendment by passing a piece of legislation. Right? Constitutional considerations override. They simply trump legislative efforts that are not constitutional amendments. So I want to say the state of in vitro fertilization is still in an ambiguous legal predicament in the state of Alabama. And
so were they were successfully charged with the manslaughter of children in this case, or just the fact that it was even questioned in that way is what's causing the uncomfortability? Like, how did this case end?
The Alabama Supreme Court found that this was, in fact, the wrongful death of a minor, right? That these embryos, these cryogenically frozen embryos were, from the perspective of Alabama constitutional law, they're children.
And this would have been hundreds of children, right? Because
it was a small number, actually.
Oh, okay.
So it wasn't – there have been cases where fertility clinics have lost power and hundreds of embryos have been lost. This was not one of those cases. This was a case where a relatively small collection of embryos was destroyed. I think 3 different couples had embryos that were destroyed in this infraction.
Okay, and so these – okay, this is interesting. So these embryos are the property and intentionally the property of the people who had donated the products to create the embryo. So the mother, this wasn't like storage for random people who would eventually want a child.
That's right. These were materials that had been intentionally created for couples, for nameable couples who planned to use them their own procreation.
Any couple,
they planned to use them for themselves.
Oh, okay. So they were storing their own product for
They were storing their own embryos for their own use.
Oh, okay. That does change how I view this.
One of the claims that you made, though, is controversial. You claimed that they're property. That's the language you used. Right. And in most states, embryos are treated as property. In fact, there's biblical precedent for this as well. I mean, in Exodus 21, 22 to 24, there are different penalties for killing fetuses and children. And the death of a fetus is treated in Exodus as the loss of property. In this case, the husband's property, since in early Jewish law, the property was not the property of the woman. The woman was in effect the property of the man.
Mm-hmm. This is a very interesting distinction. One of the most recent thing that had come across my table in the abortion conversation that is really, I feel like it was the last missing piece to me, was this distinction between harm perceived by a person and then universal harm that's perceived by nobody but still intuitively exists. Somebody had used this example of, imagine that you are a pregnant woman and then you are going to give birth to a child. When that child is born, they're going to get an inheritance of $1 million. If someone comes and steals that $1 million before the child is born, nobody knows that the $1 million was stolen. Intuitively, it feels like that child lost $1 million, even though nobody's experiencing it. That kind of points to this universal harm experienced by nobody. I think it's this like kind of weird metaphysical, like, a world exists in which that child should have $1 million, barred the action of another person. That was the only distinction. And so there's this like universal harm that intuitively people have to wrestle with.
So you want to say this is a harm that nobody suffers?
That's what I would say a universal harm is. And to me, it's important in the terms of abortion because this is why I lean pro-choice, because you're making a distinction that like, yes, a universal harm exists, but the harms to the mother are significantly more important. So that's why we would allow abortion.
I'm
Because
suspicious of this idea of universal harm. I'm
that's
I'm
okay.
uncomfortable with it.
and it's not.
Yeah. Let me tell you why, though,
Okay,
right?
okay,
Because
sure.
it seems to me that to say that there's a harm that's taken place implies at least that somebody's interests have been set back. And in the case you describe, it seems to me that the child who would have inherited $1 million has interests in inheriting that money, and that person's interests have been set back.
Yes, but nobody knows about these interests.
Well, the fact that I don't know that my interests have been set back doesn't mean that they haven't been set back.
And so that would be kind of the argument for abortion then, because even though nothing is experiencing any lack of interest being set back, at conception, any stopping of being birthed is creating that harm then. The universal harm is supposed to be a distinguishing factor that allows you to prevent somebody from existing. But if you would concede that that harm is still existing, then that would kind of put a lot of pressure on the pro-choice position.
I want to distinguish two different kinds of concerns here, right? One is the thought that we have an interest in existing, right? Do we have an interest to exist? That's one claim.
Right.
The other is the interest, if one does exist, does one have an interest in collecting $1 million? And I think those are very different kinds of circumstances.
I think they are too,
There
yes.
there are more than 2,000 years of discussion about whether we have an interest to exist.
Yes.
It goes
Yes.
back to at least to Aristotle. And in a section in Aristotle, in the Eudemian Ethics, he quotes a story where one of the gods, I believe, says, "You have no idea how much better it is for those who never exist." Right? If you really understood the human situation properly, and I'm worried that I'm misquoting Aristotle here, you would understand that it would be much better never to have been. There's actually a section in Ecclesiastes, a biblical source, right, that says, happier are those, and again, I'm worried that I'm going to misquote Ecclesiastes, happier are those who are never born, who never experience the evil that exists under the sun. And that implies that it's better not to exist than it would have been to exist.
Right, right.
But that's different. I mean, if existence is a harm, that might be a kind of universal harm. But the harm that I experience if, I might have inherited $1 million and unbeknownst to me, you scurrilously cheated me out of it. That's a harm that I experience. I mean, I might not experience it as a known harm, but I'm there to experience it. It's different from not experiencing the benefit of existence.
I do think it's different. I do think it's different, but I don't know if it's meaningfully different in terms of abortion, because I feel like what I'm trying to point to with the example of the $1 million is not necessarily to equate them. It's just trying to set the grounds for universal harms in that, like, two worlds exist because of the actions of somebody. Even though the $1 million is easy to grasp, are you of the opinion then that, like, that people would rather choose to not exist? I mean, to me, that seems like an intuitive harm.
I didn't mean to make that case. Though there, one contemporary philosopher who brilliantly makes the case that existence is bad for most of us who experience it is David Benatar, whose book Better Never to Have Been, I recommend. I think it's it's not that I'm convinced by Benatar's case entirely, but he makes a very strong case for the claim that most of us, even if we believe that we're happy to exist, most of us would have been better off if we hadn't.
Sure.
I mean, isn't it fun? It's such a pessimistic view, and yet you and I both laughed when we considered it. It's as if it's it's a twisty collection of ideas.
It points to things that are interesting.
Let me though say something about the way that this interacts with the issue of abortion. People who oppose abortion generally view abortion as a killing. So in LePage versus the Center for Reproductive Health, the Alabama Supreme Court treated the death of an embryo as the death of a person. But people who are pro-choice tend to view an embryo, a blastocyst, as a pre-person. There's no person there yet, right? And I think that's a crucial and important difference in understanding, right? When did I come to exist? Was it when the sperm and ovum met and bam, suddenly there was a new genetic individual, right? A genetic identity that had never existed before? Or did I come into existence as, right, later in the gestational process when I acquired the capability of sensitivity, the capability to have conscious mental states? And people who are pro-choice tend to understand the beginning of a person as the beginning of consciousness. When do I come to exist? Well, another way to think about that question would be to ask, when do I cease to exist? At the end of life. It's possible to have, to have permanent cessation of consciousness, even though my body continues to function, even though I continue to have reflexes. In a sense, my body can be sensitive. It turns out in the United States, there is no interstate consistency in the definition of death. So you can transport someone who is dead in one state and they immediately spring to life in the law when they move to another state, because the definition of death does no longer excludes their condition as a condition of death. I think it's worthwhile when you're thinking about origin of life issues to think about end of life issues and the way in which our views about the beginning of life inform our views about the end of life. It does seem to me that once my consciousness has irrevocably ceased, I'm not there anymore. I would prefer to live in a state that, right, recognizes me at that point as having died. But again, not every state has that understanding, and the United States is interesting because the definition of death is state by state and not determined by some federal law.
Well, yeah, and I think that's really important. I think the entire pro-life position is almost kind of justifiably scared, because once you draw a line, you're worried that you're going to be committing murder not knowing. So they're scared that the line is dangerous. They're scared that it's foggy. And so they're scared of drawing these lines. Now, when they're talking about being murdered, they're often talking about, a lot of them are religious, and so a lot of it's going to come from this universal harm experienced by God. God sees that his children are being... I'm skeptical of this even from a religious standpoint.
I'm still skeptical of this universal harm concept that you're employing. It seems to me that people who think that abortion is a harm don't think that it's a universal harm in your sense. They think that it's a harm to somebody who exists.
I agree. I completely agree. And that's the distinction that I'm trying to make, is that they're muddling these two things together, is that when they say that they're worried about drawing this line, they're actually talking about this personal harm, this like, I am being killed, like I'm dying. And they're scared of that. But then when you challenge them on when that harm comes in, that's when they start talking about, left to their devices, they're a future person. They will be a person. Now they've shifted from this personal harm that they're worried about to this universal harm, where they're saying things like, that my kid would be 9 today. Like, everyone regrets it, or like, they will be a person. You're stopping a person from existing, which is the same as killing. That's why I make the distinction, because I'm skeptical of that. I feel like people muddle, especially pro-life people, muddle these two things together. They see them as the same, which I don't think anybody actually thinks is the same. But I think in regards to this case, that universal thing becomes a little bit more important, because I think you and me would both agree that nobody's dying from their perspective, because they wouldn't have whatever X point you define as personhood. They don't have it yet because they're just this. However, there is this kind of intuitive notion. There is this harm that we should deal with, that these people were cheated out of their kid. What if they can't have a kid anymore? I feel like they should be fined for that. They should be penalized. Whether that should be the murder of a child, that's a separate thing. But that's kind of what I'm trying to get at with this distinction, is that like intuitively it still feels terrible that these embryos were destroyed, in the same way that it would feel terrible to have a miscarriage, or in the same way that it'd be terrible to have your child die. And that deserves some sort of...
Well, those seem like very different cases. We treat miscarriages very differently from the way we treat death of a child in almost all cases. Let me respond to one of the arguments that you raise here, right? Because you raise the argument from potentiality, right? An embryo is a potential person. Even if it doesn't now have the capabilities of a person, if it's implanted in a woman's uterus, it has the potential to develop into a child. One of the arguments that philosophers often raise in this context has to do with, the issue of potentiality. You are right now a potential president of the United States, but you do not now possess the right to command the armed forces of the United States into battle. So the fact that you're a potential president doesn't mean that you now possess the rights that you would have if you were a president. The corresponding argument that is often made is, if a fetus or an embryo or a blastocyst is a potential person, that doesn't mean that it's yet a person. So the fact that it's a potential person, potential president, doesn't mean that it now has the rights that it would have if it developed into a person, or that you would have if you developed into a president. So being a potential X doesn't now give you the rights of an X. I think that's an interesting argument.
Yeah. And I agree with that. And that's where, to me, when you're weighing like the pros and cons of abortion, it's like, now I will say it seems a little sneaky in that, like, left to its own devices, whatever the maternal mortality rate is, right? Whatever the rate, that is the percent chance that this person is going to become a person. So it's a lot higher than me becoming, maybe I will become president, but I see what you're saying though. But regardless of that, I agree with that, but that's where I'm talking about, like, if you were to cease that pregnancy, there's still the harm of a person was supposed to exist, barred another person's action. Now they do not. That is still a harm. But the thing with abortion is that the pros of having an abortion outweigh that harm. That harm's not that serious. It's really not that big of a deal. It's still bad. It's still not good, but the products of abortion are really good. You're thinking of the
harms in... Which harms are you considering here?
Just that universal harm of a person would exist, but now they don't. That's still bad, but it's really...
Is it bad? Is it bad? I mean, there are lots of... I mean, I have 2 kids. I could have had more. Is it a bad thing for the children I didn't have that they don't exist? Is non-existence... I'm going to adopt language from an economist I deeply respect, Partha Dasgupta. He says, is non-existence a dark, dangerous place from which we should rescue those who don't exist? Or is it something else? I mean, that seems like a very strange way of thinking about the state of non-existence. Yeah. My son Fred never existed. My grandfather's name was Fred. So my son Fred never existed. Is Fred unfortunate because of his non-existence? I don't think so.
Yeah, it definitely is. It's a fuzzy line to try to find when this universal harm is granted.
I don't think that there's a universal harm that Fred is experiencing.
What I would say, though, is that there is a unique consent to pregnancy relation via the act of having sex. Obviously, there are distinctions in which this isn't the case. But the idea of having sex and the certainty of being pregnant and having a kid is much more than, do you feel like having another kid right now? I think that there's a seriousness or like a percent chance that vastly increases of it being a reality once you become pregnant.
No, I think you're right? I mean, sex incurs a risk, and it's not just the risk that you're incurring, the risk that you'll become a parent when perhaps you don't want to become one. It imposes a risk on a non-consenting possible participant, right?
Yeah, right.
The child who might be conceived. And it's an unfortunate, I mean, look, not all children are born wanted children. And many children who are born, not wanted by their parents, many of them grow up to have wonderful lives. But not to be wanted by your parents is a misfortune. Right? So to impose that risk on a non-consenting participant is a problem.
Right. Well, and see,
Fortunately, birth control is remarkably effective, and public service announcement using multiple birth control methods together is really marvelously effective. The degree of risk you impose is truly infinitesimal. So I'm not arguing against sex here.
Right. Well, and see that, and that's where I'd say that like abortion is effective at if you're not killing. I feel like the entire abortion conversation is so dependent on whether or not it's murder, whether or not you're killing somebody. On either side, that's the silver bullet that's going to collapse the argument, is whether or not this is murder in the conventional sense.
Sure.
I feel like with this case, though, you're taking out the importance. Like, if you agree that it's not murder in the conventional sense, there is still this intuitive, like, ooh, that still feels bad that 3 parents missed out on a kid.
Sure, absolutely.
And in the same way that—
I think there was misbehavior and there was actionable misbehavior in the LePage case.
Right.
I think, in every state, improperly storing or improperly protecting cryogenically frozen embryos is a problem.
Right.
But the question is, what is the nature of that problem? If embryos are the property of their parents, of the parents who donated the genetic materials, that's one kind of problem. If embryos are a child who can be murdered, that's a very different kind of problem. Under Iowa law, embryos are property. Under most states, right, embryos are property. Apparently, in Alabama, the circumstances are relevantly different and perhaps problematically ambiguous.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think one of the interesting things, too, is a lot of people bring this up in terms of double homicide if you murder a pregnant woman. If it were before the point that you grant personhood, how would you feel about that? Killing a pregnant woman.
Again, it's state by state in the United States. And you can look back to a biblical source, right? I mean, some people look to Exodus 21, where killing a pregnant woman is regarded as murder of the woman, but property loss with respect to the fetus. So there's a biblical source that's relevant in treating an unborn embryo as property, not a person yet. Mm-hmm. There are other ambiguous sources in the Bible, of course, and people will point to those as evidence that, the biblical view here is that an embryo is a person. I don't think I'm in a position to tell people how they should interpret the Bible. I'm not going to try to do that. But we're not all Bible-believing Christians. The law of the land has to apply to all of us, no matter what our religious backgrounds. We're not a Christian nation. We are a nation that is pluralistic. We have Muslim, Buddhist, atheist, Hindu members, and the law of the land has to apply to all of us, and it's inappropriate. It would be inappropriate to use one religious background and force people who don't share those religious views to conform to someone else's religious precepts.
Well, and I think that's really interesting, especially in the religious context, because obviously people think that is not how how it lines up, right? I do think with the double homicide perspective, the way that I rationalize it is that if it were to happen before the moment of personhood, whenever you define that, the way that I rationalize it is by saying that you are taking away the potential of that life via the husband, or like that mother was going to raise that child, therefore it should be constituted in the way of murder.
So you're saying it's harm to the parents, though, not that it's look, murder, if it's murder, it's not harm to the parents. You don't take the parents into account. If it's murder, the victim is the person whose life is taken.
Right. And
so if there's no one there whose life can be taken yet, right? So if one regards a blastocyst or an early term fetus as not yet a person, it can't be murder. Well, but it still can be, taken into account in the law as a loss to the parents.
Yeah, and that would be the interesting thing. But the reason why you could constitute it as a double homicide is that given no action of anybody else, there would have been a child there. And so for the perspective of the husband who was supposed to have not only a wife, they were also supposed to have a child, there's two losses there, even though the murder only murdered one actual person and the other person experienced no loss. So there's an addition of loss to that equation.
Let me make an analogy here, because there have been policies in the United States that have improperly sterilized people, sometimes against their will. Right? If a person has been improperly sterilized, and she might not even know it, there have been cases of sterilization where doctors effected a sterilization of a patient without their knowledge. Do you want to see that that's a murder because it prevents the existence of someone that this person would otherwise have brought into existence? Because it seems to me that that's definitely a wrong. It's definitely a wrong to the person who's been improperly sterilized, but it's not a wrong to the person who would have existed if this person hadn't been sterilized. It seems to me that your view commits you to saying that there's one of these, I'm suspicious of this concept of universal harm, but it seems to me it commits you to the view that there's a universal harm that has taken place because this person has been prevented from existing.
Yeah, I would bring it back to like the huge percentage jump of there's a lot of steps in between the infertile moment versus when a child would be born, whereas the steps that are required between conception versus a child being born, the steps slowly decrease.
Okay, so it's gonna be the number of steps between the sterilization and the possible conception of a child that determines that whether this is murder or manslaughter or loss of property or loss of something else. It seems to me that this, improperly sterilizing someone isn't murder, it isn't manslaughter, it's not loss of property, it's violation of civil rights.
And I would agree with that, all of that, but I think that the moment of conception, the idea, and this is what pro-life people, again, I am pro-choice, but I have a way of rationalizing it that seems to be different than the way that you're rationalizing it, in that at the moment of conception, that person will, that concepted fetus will 100% become a person. Whereas 2 years before the moment of conception, anything can happen. So if you were to be infertilized 2 years before that, the chances of you conceiving a child or birthing a child, 1%. When conception happens, the chances of you birthing a child are 95% or whatever, the current mortality rate is right now. That would be the distinction that I'm talking about. That's what I'm referring to with this universal harm. Again, it's fuzzy. I don't have the answer yet, but I'm trying to grasp at what pro-life people are really talking about, because it gets really frustrating when they hip-hop between the line of talking about personal harm versus potentiality harm, which my idea is that potentiality is still bad, but it's massively outweighed by the benefits of abortion. Once you take abortion out, it's different.
Of potentiality. And I mentioned the potentiality argument. I kind of accept the argument that being a potential X, whatever X is, doesn't give you the rights of an X now. Mm-hmm. So being a potential president doesn't give you the rights of a president, and being a potential person, right, doesn't give a blastocyst or an embryo the rights of a person now. It does not follow from that argument that a blastocyst or embryo has no moral status whatsoever.
Right.
Right. So it does seem to me that an embryo is precious in a way. It doesn't, I'm not sure how to identify its moral status. It doesn't seem to me that it's yet a person. I don't want to say that embryos have the rights that they would have if they became president of the United States. They don't have those rights now, but it also doesn't seem right to me to say that they're just hunks of protoplasm and we could use them for cat food, for example.
Wow.
Right. That seems to me another radical position that we have good reason to reject.
Right.
So that emphasizes, I think, the fact that abortion is a really difficult issue. And it's not just an issue that is going to be solved by thinking about it in a clear philosophical mode. People who disagree with you and me don't necessarily disagree because they haven't encountered the arguments that have persuaded us. It's not a matter of lack of knowledge or lack of understanding. I think there's a real philosophical issue at the base of our disagreement about this particular area of law. And I do think that that disagreement is on stage in the Alabama Supreme Court, right?
Yeah.
So you could argue that the Alabama Supreme Court decision is outrageous, and I would argue that it's outrageous in some respects. If you read the decision, you find the Chief Justice in the Supreme Court of Alabama using expressly theological arguments in a context where it seems to me it's inappropriate to include or allow an expressly theological argument. If I make expressly theological arguments in class, that would be propagandism rather than teaching. And if a Supreme Court justice does it, there are good reasons why. I think they're the same reasons, really, right? The reasons that restrict my right to propagandize in my class are equally reasons why it's inappropriate for a Supreme Court justice in Alabama to use that position to propagandize a partisan religious perspective that he might have. It's inappropriate. That's one thought. On the other hand, the personhood amendment to the Iowa State Constitution incorporates into constitutional law in the state of Alabama a view that the Supreme Court is required to take into account as a matter of constitutional interpretation, Alabama constitutional interpretation. It can't simply overlook or override that consideration when it makes a decision. So I want to say that within the context that the Alabama Supreme Court made, I do think they made a mistake. But I think they were facing an issue that really does cut across difficult philosophical as well as jurisprudential issues that it's understandable why they divide us.
Yeah, well, I think we're getting kicked out here soon, which is a really good sign. But I want to give the opportunity to kind of close this out. If you want to summarize some of the thoughts or ideas, or if there's a general theme of this episode, this is really your opportunity to kind of just round us out.
Well, we've moved in this discussion from a discussion of future generations, right, to a discussion of abortion, which is closely related, isn't it?
Right.
And I think in both cases, those are issues that divide us. They're issues about which we can have productive conversations. And in all of these cases, the conversation that we see taking place in the public sphere often is a discussion that is bound by ideological perspectives that make it difficult or impossible for people to interact with each other. So if I want to leave with a thought, the thought is philosophically interesting issues like this can divide us, but they don't need to prevent us from having rational, cordial conversations about issues that really do cut across our most profound disagreements.
Yeah, thank you so much. I thought this was super awesome. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.